This is a fan-generated show. If you'd like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our new Rumble channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm thrilled to announce the release of my new book, Obama's True Legacy: How He Transformed America. There's a reason why Mike Huckabee calls it a ferocious and chilling read. Order it now at Amazon.com or at FrontPageMag.com. Good evening. Welcome to the Glazov Gang. Tonight, another fantastic program with another fantastic guest. Ladies and gentlemen, please remember we're a fan-generated program. We're also being heavily shadow banned and persecuted by the deep state, so we need all the help we can get. At the least, please go to our YouTube and Rumble channels and subscribe to our channel. Press instant notifications. Go to jamieglazov.com and subscribe to our newsletter. Check us out there. If you're in a giving mood, please donate through our PayPal account. Follow us on X at Jamie Glazov, on Facebook at Jamie Glazov, on Instagram at Jamie Glazov, and most importantly, keep supporting and checking out what Annie Cyrus is doing at liveuptofreedom.com. What an honor to have with us this evening, backed by popular demand, Daniel Greenfield, the CEO of the David Horowitz Freedom Center. He's the editor of the blog The Point at frontpagemag.com, and he's the author of his new book, Domestic Enemies: The Founding Fathers' Fight Against the Left. Daniel, welcome back to the program.
As always, it's good to be back on the Glazov Gang.
Daniel, you've, as always, got very profound, original insights in your work. And at Front Page, you've just recently run some stuff on Epstein at The Point and at Front Page in our main queue. And fascinating stuff. So look, we've got so much dividing the conservative movement now. You know, we have the pandemic and all the stuff they tried to do to us, but, you know, we divided over some of the issues there. We're divided over Ukraine and Russia. We're divided over Israel and Palestine, quote unquote. And now the Epstein thing that is dividing the conservative movement. Something very strange is going on. I myself personally am a bit disappointed in Trump, but I understand that there's a lot that we don't know. But he's acting strange. First, there were all these files and clients and traffickers that we were going to find out who they were. Now they don't exist. Now the Epstein thing is a Democrat hoax. A lot of eyebrows raised, but you've brought a very profound original perspective. And let me just let you take it from there and introduce what your perspective is.
Well, first of all, what I find, I've been writing about the Epstein case for over a decade. What I find really, really strange is these people who believe that the government is capable, the deep state is capable of the worst kinds of conspiracies and cover-ups, yet they were expecting that all these damning documents, videos, materials would just be sitting there in the custody of the FBI through the Biden administration. And of course, that's absurd because there's absolutely no way that would have happened. The way the Hillary Clinton investigation concluded, courtesy of the FBI, was the FBI went, they took all the hard drives from all of Hillary Clinton's people, and they wiped them. If Hunter Biden's laptops had only been in the custody of the FBI and nobody else, if nobody else had copies of those hard drives, you know that those hard drives would have been wiped completely clean. So the idea that these documents would just be sitting there waiting, especially considering how damning they would potentially be, is, I think, completely fantastic, unrealistic. Now, the problem is that there were some people who ended up in the Trump administration who made promises that they should have known they were not going to be able to keep. And that's just the state of things in, social media, where people talk big. In reality, of course, in many cases, they cannot actually deliver. Now, we actually need to take a step back and remember where this whole thing comes from. This whole thing comes from the Clintons. Jeffrey Epstein was a close associate of the Clintons. The people who actually conducted the cover-up were Democrat figures. Epstein got a sweetheart deal from Barry Kershaw, a Democrat prosecutor, not just any Democrat prosecutor, but the guy they tasked with going after Rush Limbaugh, Ann Coulter, and other conservatives. In Manhattan, Cyrus Vance Jr., he was the son of Jimmy Carter's Secretary of State, who would spend the last years of his career going aggressively after Trump, was the same Manhattan DA's office that went ahead and told the court to drop Epstein's classification of a sex offender from level 3 to level 1. New Mexico, which took Epstein off the sex offender registry 2 days after he'd been signed up on it, that was, once again, Clinton territory. It was actually run by Governor Bill Richardson, who was Bill Clinton's administration. He was actually being considered for Obama's VP instead of Biden. So these were Democrat crimes. These were Democrat cover-ups. And at the time that Trump had any involvement with Jeffrey Epstein, this was around the same time he was donating to Hillary, was donating to the Clinton Foundation, which he said was happening for business interests. He ended any ties to Epstein in 2004, and all the Democrat donors continued to meet with him for a decade. So this was very much a Democrat scandal, and it was not just a scandal, it was one of a series. Back in the day, I profiled numerous sex offenders, pedophiles, career predators of various kinds that were in the Clinton orbit. Jeffrey Epstein was one of these guys. People made him out to be the ultimate. He was one of these guys, and there was a reason these people gathered around the Clintons, especially Bill Clinton, and it's not hard to figure out, looking at Bill Clinton's record, why that would be. And it's also not hard to figure out why the Democrats would have continued to conduct this cover-up. Now, it's very revealing when they decided to drop it and actually put Epstein's name out into the public. They had no interest in him obviously, when he was flying around with Bill Clinton. They had no interest in him when he got a ridiculous sweetheart deal in Florida, to such a degree that he was given a jail cell with doors that open, which is a fun privilege. I'm sure a lot of prisoners would enjoy cell doors that open. They were not interested in him in 2008, when this whole case was going on, 2012, 2014, 2015. Suddenly, when President Trump takes office, Hillary Clinton is out, her career is over. Suddenly, now they discover that they're interested in Jeffrey Epstein. You don't have to draw a very complicated diagram to explain that one.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I really appreciated one of your recent articles and blogs where you write that, this whole Epstein thing, it's just another day in the life of the Democrats. And I was thinking of a day in the life of Ivan Denisovich. And I've been, also reflecting on how this whole thing it's a day in the life of the Democrats. So you always give a very fresh and profound perspective. Daniel, there's about 1 million, or maybe not 1 million, but let's just say 100 different pieces of the puzzle here. So let's just pick a few out and narrow in on them. Let me just start with this here. Ghislaine Maxwell, some say Ghislaine, I think she even pronounces her own name Ghislaine, if I'm correct. But Ghislaine Maxwell is in jail. So she must be in jail for a reason. If there's certain sex workers or trafficking of underage girls, and even when Pat Bondi was saying there's some kind of pedophilia videos, well, there must be abusers. If there's trafficking going on, there must be traffickers and there must be clients. So a lot of people are wondering, I think justifiably, why can't we even get one name? Is that a legitimate question?
Of course, it's a legitimate question. Look, Jeffrey Epstein was part of this powerful influence ring that tied together billionaires, guys like Bill Gates, major banks, and lots of celebrities. You look at the flight logs on this plane, it's a whole lot of celebrities. People like, say, Kevin Spacey, who, would run into his own sex abuse issues. So, what is bringing all these people together? What was the magic of Jeffrey Epstein? It's pretty obvious that much like P. Diddy, much like some of these people, one of the things he was good at was hosting parties and providing, shall we say, female companionship for these parties. There's very little doubt about that. And, we can imagine that a former president was very probably a likely participant in those parties. Now, why can't we get that? Well, the answer is we cannot actually trust the FBI. The answer is that whatever there was really damning has already been very thoroughly gone over and most likely deleted. And the idea that this information would just be sitting out there is very much a fantasy. There are accusations by some of the girls who were trafficked by Epstein, naming various people. The problem is that guys like Epstein know who to pick in many cases. They pick girls already vulnerable, and they drive them even, into mentally unstable state. And so some of the accusations we know were already proven to be untrue by probably the most prominent figure who was making some of those accusations. So the bottom line is there's no client list from Jeffrey Epstein where he was keeping the list of people who did that, videos or things like that. And it would be very unlikely for something like that to have survived throughout the Biden administration anyway.
Okay, just a second.
What we have are various accusations, and what we have are, the speculation. We know the names in the flight logs. Obviously, Bill Clinton appears there quite a bit. We know, Epstein's black book of sorts. We know the list of names that he kept, and he pretty much knew everybody famous and everybody popular. Do we have a way of directly connecting that to a particular act? That part is more debatable, but people can and will draw their own conclusions. The thing is, and I've been telling these people this over the years, over quite a few years, the expectation that there'd be this kind of final cachet of documents or videos or whatever, establishing something once and for all was never realistic. People are taking it out on President Trump, but that's fundamentally unfair. It's really the Bush administration that should have stepped in. They actually had the timing, they had the opportunity to do something about it. After that, by the time you had the Obama people coming in, it was at that point much too late. If you think anything particularly damning would have survived the Obama years, that's, another fantasy.
Okay, just a second, Daniel, just so there's no misunderstanding. You said something about a president had been involved. No, I misheard you?
No, I mean, Bill Clinton was a close associate of Jeffrey Epstein.
Right.
Jeffrey Epstein actually claimed credit for helping create the Clinton Global Initiative, which eventually becomes the Clinton Foundation. One of the things that Jeffrey Epstein is really good at is funneling money through various nonprofits and connecting them together. It's why guys like Bill Gates seek him out. So we know that Epstein was very closely tied to the Clintons, particularly to Bill Clinton.
Right, but there's these hoaxes. They're saying Trump is seen with some girl, or that there's doctored photos, or just sometimes people are just in a photo and somebody could have just had lunch or done something at some, where they were just maybe at some get together. It doesn't mean that they were doing these bad things. So even Trump has said something along the lines of it's important to protect people's reputation and privacy, etc. I get that. It's just that, look, if there's 400,000 children missing on our border, and we know what's happening to them, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there is a globalist network where, underage children are being trafficked, there's pedophilia. I think there's evidence to suggest that these horrible evils are occurring. And there's evidence to suggest that Epstein was involved in that network. And now for Trump, out of the blue, just to go, I don't know why people are talking about Epstein. What's going on? Why? Forget about it. It's very eyebrow raising, and it's kind of insulting to the people who supported him. And it's also kind of insulting, well, not even kind of, it's very insulting to people who care about the victims of sex trafficking and sex abuse. Isn't it, Daniel?
Look, from President Trump's perspective, Epstein was a guy he knew over 20 years ago. He broke relations with him in 2004. Of course, he's not especially interested in it. And, he's not exactly where we are in a lot of cases. It's understandable that people are outraged and upset. I spent a lot of time writing about this. I was outraged and upset. The reality, though, is that the case is unfortunately way too old. It's not something you can just dig up and revisit and revise. It's like, the JFK assassination or some other things that are just a whole lot of time has passed. From President Trump's time perspective, he's not viewing this as a political issue. He's viewing this as a guy he knew 20 years ago. He's sick and tired of being connected to. He knows the media is now going to start trying to connect him to Epstein, even though, again, Trump was not a government official. He was not capable of protecting Epstein, and he was not at all involved in any kinds of these cover-ups. He was not a government official, an elected official, until really the end of Epstein's career. So he's sick and tired of being connected to it. He's understandably frustrated. People, on the other hand, are understandably frustrated and upset that their complaints are not being taken seriously, that they were promised these files, and the people who promised them, and it was not Trump who was making these promises, by the way, the people who promised them should never have been making these promises. And that's just a reality of it. And
But
people now
Daniel, to
understand that we're upset
say,
because if you promise people something and then you don't deliver and you put on this kind of show where you have these influencers show up and you give them worthless nonsense, then yes, people have a right to be upset, but that is not President Trump. President Trump was not doing this stuff.
but but to suggest out of the blue that the whole Epstein thing is just a Democrat hoax, that's a little bit eyebrow raising, isn't it?
Well, from President Trump's perspective, he's being attacked by the Democrats over this, and they try to go after him once he actually took office, because the first time the Democrats actually wanted to talk about this was the Acosta nomination. And for President Trump, in many ways, I think this was an out of the blue thing. This was not something that he was on track with, that he was staying on top of, and I don't think it was something that he heard much about until very recently. So from his perspective, it's something that the media is using to attack him. And he hasn't properly heard from some of his supporters who were very passionate and still are very passionate and upset about it.
Yeah, I don't know. I understand. Look, I love Trump. I've been, a huge Trump supporter. He's disappointed me on a few things. I think they should have pushed the regime in Iran harder. Been a bit disappointed with some of the leniency in his words about Putin, etc., and some of the policies there in the past with softness on Putin, although I understand the Ukraine issue is complicated. But now just this thing, to say that my eyebrows have been raised might be an understatement. But look, we want to be on the team, and I get that. So where do I want to go? Okay, so let's just transfer over here for a second, because you dealt very well with this in some of your work. Okay, so there's this Alex Acosta gentleman that was overseeing this case in Florida, and there's debate about exactly what he said, and that's a little murky. But overall, there's there is some evidence to suggest that he had said that he was told to back off because Epstein was intelligence. But now he's being a little bit cloudy on exactly what it is that he said. What we know is you're documenting as well in your work that there was a lot of special treatment of Epstein. There were light sentences. There were officials colluding to keep him off the sex offender registries. The way he was treated in the prison was very strange. Then even surrounding his suicide, these inmates are removed, cameras don't work, etc. So all of this is very strange. What do you think? But okay, why am I saying all this? It seems to suggest that either intelligence is involved, or that very big people in high places have an interest and had an interest in keeping him safe and out of prison, right? And didn't want him to talk.
So the Acosta quote, there were two cases. There was a local case. This is the one that actually landed him in the Palm Beach stockade in a private wing, and he got to do work release in his own beachfront home. That was the local case. There was also a federal case that was supposed to be headed up by Alex Acosta. He did not do a very good job. But about the intelligence quote, so what happens is that Acosta, obviously, as a Trump nominee, he gets interviewed. Now, the Daily Beast publishes this supposed quote by Acosta in which he says that he was told that Epstein belonged to intelligence. The quote doesn't actually come from Acosta. It comes from supposedly somebody anonymously in the Trump team, supposedly telling a Daily Beast reporter that this is what Acosta said. Acosta has denied saying it. Who knows where the truth lies? But I think, without necessarily resorting to the intelligence explanation, the simple fact is that Epstein was hanging around some of the most powerful people in the world, including the Clintons. He helped set up the Clinton Global Foundation, which itself was this massive money laundering and influence peddling operation with a global scale. You have a litany of dictators, oligarchs, billionaires that were pushing money to the Clinton global initiative, to the Clinton machine. There were massive abuses happening there. And this is even without delving into whatever Bill Clinton might have been doing with any of Epstein's girls. And there were a whole bunch of wealthy and powerful people, billionaires, and not just billionaires, but international leaders in Epstein's orbit. Any combination of those people might have been enough to A, potentially protect Epstein, and B, potentially off him. Because yes, this entire process was absolutely suspect from beginning to end. Epstein got sweetheart deals repeatedly in different states and different localities. And I have trouble believing that it was happening because the CIA or the Mossad or MI6 or whoever were going to, this place in New Mexico or the Manhattan DA's office or the Palm Beach stockade and saying, well, you've got to do special favors for Jeffrey Epstein. That I find highly skeptical. Now, Clinton associates going over and saying that would be entirely plausible because you have to kind of flash back to the Clinton era. And if you recall, when Bill Clinton was accused of sexual misconduct, the entire Democrats rallied. This became a litmus test. You have to absolutely defend and protect Bill Clinton's sexual abuses, just as later you had to defend and protect Joe Biden's hair sniffing, Hunter Biden's abuses, and all the stuff. This became a litmus test. So to me, this is not so much the mark of intelligence as it's the mark of partisan Democrats just getting behind the party and being willing to do absolutely anything, commit any crimes for the guy who is in the White House, in this case, was going to be in the White House, in the case of Hillary Clinton.
Thank you, Daniel. Okay, let's really zero in here on one of the accusations being made here in terms of against Israel, and something that's happening in our community, if that's one way I can name it or say it. In the conservative movement, we used to be so united, but now in terms of the Tucker Carlsons, Candace Owenses, Ian Carrolls, and other people, there's this rising anti-Semitism, a rising anti-Israel disposition. And so there's this thing how Israel controls U.S. foreign policy. Israel is getting us into wars. America is a slave to Israel. And so they're tying this in together here, that Epstein is connected. Their argument is Epstein is connected to Israeli intelligence, and that was a blackmail operation in part of American politicians. Perhaps that's how the thinking goes. And then they kind of are able to blackmail American decision makers because of all this or whatever it is. So into this formula comes this individual, Ari Ben-Manash, a former Israeli intelligence insider, that kind of is this whistleblower now. And so he's alleged that Epstein was a Mossad asset involved in espionage and clandestine sex operations. So this really falls into this package that these anti-Israeli individuals use to argue this. Now, there's quite a bit of evidence against this, and you've made some very strong arguments. So we've got the former prime minister, I think, of Israel recently coming out saying that there's no substance to any of this. And you've pointed out that if Epstein had any kind of Mossad connections, he simply wouldn't be conducting himself and wouldn't have conducted himself in the way he was. You've pointed out, for instance, why would he be hanging around with Naomi Campbell or Chris Tucker or Kevin Spacey? He'd be doing very serious things. That's one thing to start with, and hanging out with much more bigger people on many levels. Let me give this to you in terms of this argument that's being used about Epstein to pursue a kind of anti-Israel disposition.
Well, if Epstein had been run by the Mossad, first of all, he would have his black book would have been full of Iranian nuclear scientists, not Naomi Campbell.
Why?
They would have been targeting Muslim terrorists, would have been targeting the Middle East rather than hanging out in a ranch in New Mexico and an island in the Virgin Islands. And secondly, yes,
wait a minute. Why? Wait a minute. Why? Because Mossad's biggest interest would be to compromise the Muslim people, right?
Yeah, the Mossad's operations are targeted primarily at the Muslim world.
I see. Instead of Kevin Spacey and Chris Tucker. Okay.
Yeah, and Ehud Barak, a former Israeli prime minister, would never have been allowed to hang around a Mossad operation. That's like putting up a sign saying Israelis here. So that part is pretty ridiculous. But, I have to say, Tucker Carlson is a guy who has spent much of the last few years around the Middle East. He spent it in Dubai, he spent it in Qatar and other countries, where, by the way, it's entirely legal to have sex with 9-year-olds under the tenets of Sharia, under the tenets of Islamic law. These are places that are actually notorious for actual sex trafficking, and they're notorious also for blackmail operations. You have these various princelings from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, from the Emirates who come to here. They come to California, and we've had repeated sex slave cases involving them, cases in which case they fled and actually got away with it. So that is actually full-on Epstein territory. It's Epstein completely legalized and protected by Islamic law. And I'm not saying Tucker Carlson is doing anything there, but the basic reality is he's spending a lot of time in some of the sex trafficking capitals of the world, sex trafficking that's protected by Islamic law.
And your implication is not necessarily that he's involved in it, but that if he's so outraged by these things, why is he silent about it, right?
And if he's that outraged about
Right.
Abuse of underage children, that would be a
Yes.
very good place to talk about it, because Dubai is a place that actually depends on slave labor. It's a place where women are trafficked from Southeast Asia, from the Indian subcontinent repeatedly. Their passports are taken away and they're abused. And we've actually, the few actual slave cases that we've had in America have involved Muslim families. So that's something he will not talk about. He won't say anything negative about Islam. And that's a major, major omission, because if you want to talk about the abuse of young girls, you want to talk about sex trafficking, it's happening in the Middle East and the Muslim world on an impossible scale.
Well, yes, Daniel, and that's, in my view, the bingo right there. I think that that just crystallizes everything, because I watch a lot of Tucker. I watch a lot of Candace. I keep my eyes on a lot of these individuals. And, you know, without saying they're on certain issues, these people are good on other issues in terms of against the globalists and, you know, what happened during the pandemic. I got all that. They took some good stances that we agree with, or I agree with. But this Israel thing, it's very interesting. You know, so when I watch Candace, when I watch Tucker, there's not one... For instance, there's a genocide going on against Christians. I've yet to see Candace do one show where she would invite you or Robert Spencer or Annie Cyrus or David Wood or Bosch Foston and talk about the Islamic theology and the verses and the texts that serve as an inspiration and a sanctioning to the mass murder and genocide of Christians. The kidnappings of young girls in Pakistan that are Christian or Hindu, and also that's happening in India, and rape and forced conversion to Islam. No paying attention to it. What's happening to the abuse of women in Iran in terms of the veil and how that's rooted in the Quran? What's happening to Christians in Nigeria? If it is mentioned, they sort of say something about how, well, the Jews are behind all of that. And that is, to say the least, so weak. And I wouldn't even know where to start. But overall, Daniel, there seems to be some kind of Stockholm syndrome with Islam, that there is absolutely no criticism of jihad and where it finds its foundations. And I think that crystallizes where these people really stand, right?
Yeah, Islam is the point at which the so-called opposition media becomes the controlled opposition media, because you look at what Tucker says about Islam, or more specifically, doesn't say, or Candace Owens, and it is identical to what you get on CNN. Christians are being massacred on an ongoing basis. Churches are being blown up in Nigeria, and there's not a word about it. There isn't a single word about it. I recently wrote about the seeming disappearance of 1 million Christians in the census in Uzbekistan. And again, there's absolutely no coverage, no interest of that. So Islam is the point at which you see that these people are controlled, that they're bought and paid for. And again, we see all these interviews, these fawning, flattering interviews that Tucker Carlson does with leaders of Muslim countries in the Middle East, particularly wealthy ones. He praises them. He talks about how wonderful and how great they are. And, you know, when it comes time to interview Ted Cruz, it's a hostile interview. It's a series of attacks. But when it comes to interviewing Muslim dictators, he loves them very much. He's appearing repeatedly at events like the World Government Summit in Dubai, where he's critical of America, but he praises these Muslim dictatorships. So it's not even subtle. It's not that you have to read into things or look very hard for. It's very obviously a case where some of these people are bought and paid for.
Aha. What do you think that is there? Do you think it's money? Is it some kind of hatred in their heart? Like, it's very, very obvious for us with eyes that see that Candace, who postures as a Christian, will not say a word about the victims of jihad and will not explore what gives inspiration and sanctioning to jihad. Not a word. So somewhere they're allied with the jihadists and the Islamic world against Israel, right? But when you say bought and paid for, what do you think really is there? It's an anti-Semitism, or is it some kind of Stockholm syndrome?
Well, the Saudis, others, these Gulf billionaires have been buying and selling Americans, American politicians, Western thinkers and leaders for around 70 years. They bought up much of our universities, particularly crucial ones. They bought up a whole lot of political interest. They bought up a whole lot of the media. The media is now basically Al Jazeera. So buying up influencers is no big deal for them. Now, do I know exactly what the arrangement is? No, but the bottom line is once Tucker left Fox News, his tone changed dramatically on certain issues, and Islam is the biggest of those issues. I've been on Tucker's show twice, and the change is very marked. I've talked to people off the record who also say that change is very marked. Do I know what's going on in the SO? Do I know what's going on in Candace's SO? Well, I would suspect that Candace genuinely hates Jews after her big documentary debut fell apart because Kanye West was a nut job. And I think she blames Jews for that. But the bottom line is, I think these people are very happy to get into bed with some of America's enemies. Rather than being any kind of patriotism, what you get from them tends to be America's terrible. And once you start thinking America's terrible, well, you start thinking maybe America's enemies have a point. And that's what you tend to see in the content of some of these people. And this is the dangerous leftist pathways. It's why some of these people are now being called woke right, because when you really adopt a lot of the thinking of the left, and a key part of the left's thinking is America is absolutely terrible, well, then you go down the rest of the road and you become a traitor.
Absolutely. It's so interesting and fascinating how it's just one, you just say one thing and you really show somebody for who they really are. Candace and Tucker, if you care so much about human rights and women and children and Christians, have a show on Mahsa Amini and what happened to her, and invite Robert Spencer and Daniel Greenfield and Annie Cyrus, or one of them, to discuss what inspires and sanctions the forced veiling of women and the punishments of those who don't. Just have a show. When we see those bombings of the churches, and when we see what's happening in Nigeria, and when the jihadists are screaming Allahu Akbar, have a show where you explain and have experts explaining why they're screaming Allahu Akbar and why they're killing Christians. They won't do it. And I think that says everything. Let's go back a little bit here. And I guess this is all, of course, connected. Let's just go back to Epstein here for a minute. But I like very much and am very impressed with your arguments. And everybody should always be reading Daniel Greenfield at Front Page Magazine. But this is a day in the life of the Democrats, ultimately, on many levels. But you also mentioned Sandy Berger, and I want to spend a minute on that, if not a couple minutes. It's interesting how that's been just kind of swept onto the rug, but this was very interesting. So during the Clinton administration, if I'm not mistaken, Sandy Berger, or remind us when it was, but Sandy Berger stuffed documents about Clinton's bin Laden policy into his socks, but he got caught. This doesn't get enough attention. What happened there, and what's its significance?
Sandy Berger was Bill Clinton's national security advisor. He was recently deceased, actually. And obviously the Clintons would cover up whatever it was they were doing inside the government when they actually controlled the government, which is, again, why I say you can't really realistically expect to find much in the way of documents once Democrats have had 48 years to clean house. But At the time, the bin Laden thing was not an issue, so they never bothered to cover that up. Then 9/11 happens, and suddenly people are looking again at why did Bill Clinton not take out bin Laden? Why did he abort multiple efforts to take out bin Laden? Why was he giving a speech in Australia around that time saying, I could have taken him out, but I didn't do it? So Sandy Burgos, Clinton's national security advisor, goes into the National Archives, and he starts, trying to get these documents out. You're not supposed to take documents, original documents, obviously, at the National Archive, but he starts stuffing documents into his socks, which, he ends up being caught, and the whole thing is kind of treated as a joke. And it is kind of funny because, you've got this guy who's former national security advisor, and he's trying to stuff documents into his socks and escape with them. But this was really covering up Bill Clinton's complicity in Al-Qaeda, his complicity in causing the deaths of over 3,000 people on 9/11 and everything that happened since then. So on the one hand, it's kind of funny. On the other hand, it's obviously very emblematic of just how the Democrats are determined to cover everything up. And the reality being that you cannot just go in and expect to do a Freedom of Information Act and expect to get damning documents, because anything that they can get to, they will destroy. If they control the government, they're just going to have the FBI destroyed. If they don't control the government, they'll stuff it in their socks if they have to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was very, very interesting. And he got very lenient treatment, didn't he, Sandy Berger, for that?
Of course he did. People brought it up when you had the whole FBI raid of Mar-a-Lago, the targeting of President Trump over documents, the whole National Archives circus. But yes, Sandy Berger got a slap on the wrist, just like Biden got a slap on the wrist for taking home documents that he shouldn't have.
Well, let's narrow in on that too, because you're writing about, look, I keep using this expression. My eyebrows are a bit raised right now also, just in terms of all of this and some of the things Trump has said. Yes, I want to be a team player. I thank God every day we have Trump instead of Kamala. And I believe strongly in not shooting the general that's on the front lines. But then you can only go so much when you feel that something is not right. But you're also showing that this is very much a Democrat enterprise and the hypocrisy of the Democrats here. So now all of a sudden the Democrats want disclosure and they want to see the Epstein files, but there's hypocrisy here on a million levels. And you're also showing that when it comes to Hunter Biden and when it comes to what President Biden was doing in terms of money laundering, whether it was with China and other business that Biden was involved in, there was a lot of corruption there, and the Democrats are showing quite a bit of hypocrisy here, right?
We'll probably never get to see the Epstein videos or anything like that, but we have the Hunter Biden videos because Hunter Biden was a crackhead, and so his poor sense of judgment led him to just drop off some laptops in the very wrong laptop repair shop. And we had this. We saw this, and they continued to lie about it, to cover it up, and then to give Hunter Biden, let him get away with it. So we could see the whole kind of Epstein, quasi-Epstein case happening in real time, and we could see exactly how they would proceed. And the bigger scandal in the Hunter Biden case, just like I think the bigger scandal in the Jeffrey Epstein case, was just a larger network behind it, the way this was used to enable all sorts of other criminal enterprises. And that's not to say that we shouldn't take seriously Hunter Biden's treatment of women, whatever else was going on there. Joe Biden's treatment of girls and other stuff there that has not really been properly discussed, and a lot of this runs in the family. But the bottom line is this was part of a larger nexus of corruption. This was selling access for power to foreigners, to foreign governments, certainly in the Biden case. And what the resulting corruption undoubtedly had a very, very destructive effect on the United States of America. And it just shows that this kind of thing has been going on for a while. It continues going on. The names change, but the Democrats continue to behave like this.
Daniel, this auto pen business, very troubling. So Biden approved these pardons. There were all these pardons. But now in terms of the auto pen presidency, it turns out he didn't control the auto pen. What exactly is going on here? And this is kind of illegal, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I've called this the senility coup. The senility coup has been going on for quite a while. We don't know exactly how much. I don't know how much confidence I have in congressional hearings to expose it. But the bottom line is Biden was only running so many things. The auto pen was just a very useful tool. And the people who controlled it were the ones who actually set the agenda. And the way they argue with the pardon is that Biden gave a kind of general approval, and then they just put down whatever names they wanted to, which, is a situation where who's actually calling the shots? Is it the president who's calling the shots, or is it the staffers who are calling the shots? And it's very clearly with Biden a case where the staffers were the one calling the shots. They put down names, and the auto pen signed it. And what was Biden's actual involvement in all of this? Well, it's Weekend at Bernie's. His involvement supposedly was that he agreed to some of this, but you actually had pardons being signed by an auto pen for names that were not actually directly being approved by Biden. And that's not actually how legal pardons are even supposed to work.
Okay, just a second. So in other words, let's just suppose you and I are okay, I don't mean we would do this. I just mean this is what's going on. So there's just this guy shaking hands with invisible people and wandering around in a field. And then we go, hey, listen, man, let's get this guy out of prison. Here, write his name down. Okay, let's get him out. Here you go. And then there's just this thing that signs it robotically. That's what was going on, right?
Yeah. Well, the staffers assembled a list of names. The staffers then signed the pardons with an auto pen. And, they claim that, Biden was fine with this. Trust us. Come on. This is not a presidency. This is the staffers running the White House. And we already knew this was going on. This is just further evidence of this. And it raises real questions about the legality of the pardons, because I have to say Biden pardoned a lot of violent, dangerous criminals. He also pardoned some of the most corrupt, some of the biggest con artists, thieves, frauds. In recent history, I assembled a list back in the day. These were people who ripped off millions and millions of people in Ponzi schemes, and they got pardoned. So there was definite quid pro quo going on. It just wasn't necessarily with the Bidens. It was with whoever was actually making these decisions at the White House level. And that is a very, very big problem, because we now have not only Biden not actually running the White House, but we have other people running the White House, making deals. The people did not elect any of this. They were not actually representing the American people. It really is it's incredibly corrupt, and there should be consequences.
And we can only pray that there's consequences, but it just seems like it's so hard to get justice on so many levels. Speaking of...
case shows us that we need to really act urgently. We can't wait for 20 years to go by. We have to jump on it. So really, the Trump administration, the DOJ, Congress should be making sure subpoenaing all the communications of all Biden staffers and not waiting around just to get them through televised hearings, but grabbing as much evidence as possible out of the gate.
Speaking of justice and injustice, German Judge Anne-Mayer Göring, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, has let 8 migrant men go free after they assaulted a 15-year-old girl for 3 hours. So this was a gang rape of 3 hours of a 15-year-old girl. They're migrants from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Morocco, Turkey. So I think we could kind of guess what ideology they're following. And so there's a gang rape here of a 15-year-old girl for 3 hours. So this judge has freed them because of quote-unquote migration frustration. And so here again we have the unholy alliance cropping up. I was just kind of thinking about, that this is a female judge, and this has to be treated here with care. Because us men need to cultivate ourselves, and we've got our weaknesses, our strengths and our weaknesses, but we also have male biological ingredients of our character and psychology. And women have their strengths, weaknesses, but I'll try to make this quick. I don't mean to, but I think it's an important point to make here, that women have to cultivate themselves too. And so when a woman knows her own instincts and cultivates herself, just like we need to cultivate ourselves, then, problems can be avoided. But if a woman taps into her empathy, but doesn't cultivate wisdom and doesn't cultivate an understanding of where her empathy could go in terms of her female traits, and becomes a leftist and becomes a leftist feminist, something could go very wrong here. And I think that that's very important to stress here, because this is very much a story also of leftist feminism. but obviously also Stockholm Syndrome with Islam. Let me stop my lecture here, but this is just outrageous, but it very much symbolizes what the left is about, what leftist feminism is about. A gang rape of a young girl by Islamic migrants, and a leftist female judge sets them free because of migration frustration. What do you make of what I'm saying, Daniel?
Well, empathy is a series of choices. It's a question of who you choose to empathize with. And here there was a pretty clear choice of who to empathize with. A 15-year-old girl had been violently sexually assaulted, or Muslim migrant men, probably a very young men of military age. So the decision she made to empathize with them is not unfortunately unique. It's something we tend to see quite a bit. Whether it's on college campuses in Western nations, it's a very perverse, what people call toxic empathy. But we've seen this over and over again. After October 7th and the brutal sexual assaults there, you had mobs gathering to empathize with Hamas. And, there have been sexual assaults, a legion of them in Germany, but all across Europe. And again, so many of these activists turn out into the streets and say that we must empathize with the perpetrators, we must empathize with the migrants, not with our own population. And leftism trains people to direct their empathy that way, to see everything in terms of power relations and victim, and see it through an ideological lens that the Muslim migrants are there. They're coming to transform Europe, and the native population can't be the real victims. The migrants have to be the real victims. They're the ones who are generally oppressed because there's a power imbalance. Even a 15-year-old girl who's German, who's European, who's Western, who's white, is less of a victim than the men raping her. And we've seen the left make this argument over the years. Before it was Muslim migrants, it was criminals. The Black Panthers who promoted rape. Were defended as being the victims because they were just really oppressed by the system. So the left make this toxic empathy argument over and over again, and empathy is very much a matter of choices. So when you choose to stand with the abusers because of your ideology, what you're doing is, of course, betraying the innocent and the vulnerable. We started this kind of talking about the Clintons. One of the more memorable moments in the Hillary Clinton 2016 campaign was the exposure of a tape from back when Hillary Clinton was just operating as a pro bono lawyer. And she goes out and she is asked to take the case of this violent rapist who assaulted, I believe, was a 12-year-old girl, not just sexually assaulted her, but assaulted her so violently that she was in a coma. He beat her body. And Hillary Clinton is on tape talking about how she got a sweetheart deal for this guy, and she's laughing about it. She's telling jokes about it. She has zero empathy for it. When you listen to that tape, you understand that this is the woman who's going to have zero empathy for Bill Clinton's victims. You understand that Bill Clinton ends up picking the absolute perfect mate for himself. And you understand that a lot of these leftists who claim they're so bleeding heart, they care so much, they're just so full of, and how dare you not be as outraged as they are. These people have absolutely zero empathy for actual victims. In fact, in some cases, they actually quote it. They find it funny. They enjoy it. They're actually very cruel people who pretend to be empathetic, who pretend to be sensitive. There's a class of leftists who are genuinely bleeding hearts. They're genuinely empathetic. They're genuinely sympathetic. It's just misdirected. It's funneled through the guise of ideology. But there's a class of leftists, and these are the people who are the most vocal. In many cases, they're the ones who are political leaders, who are absolutely incapable of any meaningful empathy. They operate like sociopaths. They actually find the sort of abuses of people actually very funny, and they use it as a pathway to power, but they have absolutely no actual empathy for them whatsoever.
Absolutely. And what I'm trying to touch on here is just very politically correct and frowned upon, what I'm trying to emphasize as well, because there's gender differences, and males often could do better in certain spheres of making judgments and punishments, although they also have to cultivate themselves. And women have certain traits, but it can be very much misused if they don't cultivate themselves and if they're not manipulated by a certain ideology. So in terms of female empathy, which is a beautiful thing on a million levels, and that's why they're also such wonderful mothers and are supposed to be mothers, that if the left gets a hold of them and manipulates that empathy and takes away the wisdom and the need for punishment, it can really confuse matters. So what we end up having is leftist feminists, and they'll look, for instance, the women on The View, let's say Whoopi Goldberg or Sonny Hostin or Joy Behar, they'll look at maybe somebody they'll look, let's say, at female victims of, let's say, Trump's ICE, and they'll say, "Oh, poor immigrants," even though they're illegals, but they'll say, "Oh, poor women, poor women." But then when it's a woman being raped by an Islamic rapist, all of a sudden it's the poor rapist. It's very interesting how their twisted mindset works, right?
Well, you can go back to the era of the Me Too movement, where suddenly there was a lot of outrage about abuses in Hollywood, and everybody knew this stuff. None of this was actually new. This was one of those scandals where they fake outrage and they fake pretense. And so many of these women, whether it's on The View or anywhere else, who were in this industry were very well aware of what was going on, and they were laughing about it. To them, it was absolutely nothing.
Daniel, I think our time is up. I think a great way to end would be on one of your recent blogs, Masks for Them, or excuse me, one of your articles for Front Page, Masks for Them, Not for Us. And again, leftist hypocrisy. So we see this thing now among the left, that the ICE are wearing masks. The ICE officials and officers are wearing masks. They're really against masks. But when it comes time for masks during, let's say, the pandemic, masks were okay. Very interesting, right?
Well, you have to understand two things. One is that the common pattern of the left is always this: we have always been at war with Oceania, we have always been at war with East Asia, where they take whatever it is they claim to believe, they flip it around whenever it opportunistically serves them. And the second thing is they do this in part on purpose, because they want their followers not to have an internalized set of values. They want them to be able to pivot, to shift with whatever the left says is the current dogma, without actually asking questions. So they went from, yes, masks are the most wonderful thing, and you still see people are still wearing masks. It's a little bit ridiculous in some cases. But on the other hand, of course, now they're violently attacking the idea of wearing masks. Not all that long ago, they were actually campaigning for wearing masks, not because of the COVID stuff anymore. Now it was because of the Hamas riders, and the Hamas riders should be able to cover their faces with masks, and it's a major health issue for them to wear masks while rioting. And literally months have gone by since they've made these arguments in New York and in California. And then, of course, right away they swap with how dare ICE wear masks. They should take their masks off, and they start, the same people who had bills forcing everyone to conform and wear masks are now flipping around and going, we need to have new bills forcing ICE to take off masks. So again, this is very common with the left. They don't actually have a position on masks. What they have is a position on power, and whatever serves them at any given time. Masks, no masks, is the only thing that actually matters. And they do this also in part on purpose, because they actually want people to not be able to rely on their own judgment. They don't want them to be able to say, well, we believe what we believed 2-3 years ago. It's kind of like the people who start quoting Martin Luther King, the content of the character, not the color of the skin. No, we don't believe that anymore. We believe the most important thing is the color of the skin. It's important to wear masks. No, right now it's important to take the masks off. So they want people to absolutely have to shift and pivot all the time to keep up and to feel insecure and to not think for themselves.
Oh boy, Daniel, I think you and I have devoted our lives to exposing just this demonic, evil ideology and movement, which is the left. And we could just go on and on. There's just so much evil there. And what you're saying right now, just how this hypocrisy. I remember just during my PhD studies, the graduate students, the leftist ones, which was almost all of them. But I remember the feminist leftist graduate students, and they're just so upset. Cynthia only had 4 abortions. She needs to have 5. Women's rights. And I would be like, oh, you're really for abortion, women's rights. But since you're so for women's rights, I have a petition here to stop acid attacks on women's faces in the Islamic world. When they're not properly veiled, and against honor killings, and against female genital mutilation in the Islamic world. Could you just sign right here? And they would just turn ashen white. And they're just not interested in those kinds of women's rights. And then the questions begin. Are you a fascist? And let's leave it at that moment. But I just was always going home every day from the university, just feeling like I've been poisoned by some kind of arsenic or something being around those people. But let's keep fighting them and exposing them. Daniel, final words of wisdom from you for this evening?
We're winning. The Trump administration is not doing everything right, but it's doing a lot of things. It's breaking ground in ways previous administrations have not done. And the left wants to demoralize you. They want you to feel like you're losing. And there are people on the far right, the woke right, that also want you to feel like Trump is failing, like you're losing. They want to demoralize you. They want to tear you down. They might want to make you feel confused and defeated. Don't let them do that, because they're the enemies of everything. They're our enemies, and they're the enemies of America.
Are they ever? Daniel, for those that don't know, that are on the edge of their seat right now, where can they follow you and support you?
Well, I have the honor of being published at frontpagemag.com, Front Page Magazine, which you might know something about as the editor of Front Page. And I also have my own site at danielgreenfield.org.
Fantastic. And everybody should be reading your blog, The Point, at frontpagemag.com, your articles at frontpagemag.com. Everybody should get your book, Domestic Enemies, and follow you on X. I love your X profile and everything that you post there, Daniel. Daniel, thank you for always being on the front lines of telling the truth and fighting against tyranny. You're a stand-up guy. Thank you.
And thank you for always being there to listen.
Thank you. Thank you for joining the Glazov Gang this evening. We'll see you soon. Good night.